It's not a very pleasant visualization exercise, but like imagine that you lose your job, say, or tomorrow your bank goes bust and you lose all your money, or your child gets arrested in a student protest and gets sent to jail or something. Something bad happens to you, and it really upsets you, and you can't really cope with your emotions. You get into a kind of emotional crisis. Who would you talk to in that situation? Who would you turn to for consolation and solace? You might talk to, I don't know, your husband or your wife. You might talk to your parents. You might go and pour your heart out to your best friend in a pub. Perhaps you might go to a priest and talk to him. You might, if you can afford it, you might go to a therapist, or you might go to a pharmacist and get some antidepressants or some stress drugs. Probably the last person you think of talking to is a philosopher. I mean, where would you find one to talk to anyway? I mean, you could go to a university philosophy department, but they've got their hands full marking papers and applying for funding. There's no kind of philosophy hotline that you could call. So really, I mean, that would be the last person you'd think of going to. But if you lived in Athens, 2,000 or so years ago, and you fell into some kind of emotional crisis, then there's a big chance that you would turn to philosophy for help, and you'd know where to go to find it. You'd know that Diogenes the Cynic was living in a barrel in the marketplace, so you go and see him for advice. You know that the Stoics hung out under the Stoa Poikile, which was the colonnade, so they'd be there and you could ask them for advice. You know that the Epicureans lived in their commune on the outskirts of town. You knew that Plato had his academy. So you had all these different options you could go to for therapy and advice, and they all had their different types of philosophical therapy. So really, in the ancient world, in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome, philosophy was quite close to what we think of today as therapy. And they claimed very much that philosophy was something that could heal you of emotional suffering. So for example, Epicurus said, empty is that philosopher's argument by which no human suffering is therapeutically treated. Cicero says, there is, I assure you, a medical art for the soul. It is philosophy, whose aid need not be sought as in bodily diseases from outside ourselves. We must endeavour with all our resource and strength to become capable of doctoring ourselves. There's this idea of self-help. And Epictetus, as a Stoic philosopher from the 2nd century AD, said, it's not events but our opinions about them that cause us suffering. So how exactly would philosophy cure us of emotional suffering? Well, this last quote gets to the heart of it. Most of the Greek philosophical schools thought that emotional suffering was caused by our beliefs. If we had false beliefs or irrational or plain wrong beliefs, they would cause us to interpret the world wrongly, and that would make us unhappy. So they had what's called the cognitive theory of emotions. Something happens to us. We then interpret it through the kind of prism of our beliefs, and then that leads to our emotions. So if we're in deep emotional suffering, there's a good chance that the reason we are is because of our beliefs, because of our the beliefs that we hold. So we go to a philosopher, and they'd engage us in a kind of dialogue, a Socratic dialogue, and they'd find out how we saw the world, what kind of beliefs we held, and whether those beliefs made sense or were rational. And if they weren't, they tried to persuade us to kind of let go of those beliefs and to hold wiser or more philosophical beliefs. So that was how their therapy worked. And all the philosophical schools claimed that their own personal philosophy would give you happiness, would make you happy. So the idea was that if you studied philosophy for long enough, you'd achieve something called Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia literally meant having a kindly demon. You means kindly and daemon means your soul. So it means living in harmony with your soul. But it also in general meant being fulfilled, living a flourishing life, or being happy. So the idea was that philosophy wasn't just something you did in your free time, or maybe it's something you studied. It was something that was at the very heart of being human, and it helped you to achieve fulfillment, to become the most you could be, the most kind of fulfilled a human being you could be. So Aristotle, for example, said the philosopher more than any other will be happy. Zeno of Citium, who was the founder of Stoicism, said that happiness is a good flow of life. They also claimed that true virtue is living according to nature, so that you're fulfilling your nature. Which is, again, quite a very different idea to how we think of in modern life. We don't really think of philosophers as happier than other people. If anything, we probably think of them as more miserable and neurotic and wrapped up in themselves rather. But they claim that philosophy would really make us truly happy and fulfilled people. Now, on the one hand, they said that philosophy would help us fulfill our nature. But we think perhaps today of, if you say live according to nature, you might think that means just going with the flow, like in a kind of 60s hippie way, just doing whatever we felt like doing. But there was a bit of a paradox, because they believed that living according to nature took a lot of work. It took a lot of training, even a lifetime of training, to live according to nature. So, in other words, kind of philosophy means moving from your lower nature to your higher nature. It involves developing what's best within you. So there's this idea in ancient philosophy that philosophy is not just about reading or studying. It involves hard work and exercises and training. They called this ascesis, which literally means kind of training or exercises. So Diogenes, he's this guy down at the bottom sleeping in a barrel. He said that nothing in life has any chance of succeeding without strenuous practice. And Diogenes was the arch example of this. He said he could prove that humans don't need, fancy houses or nice clothes or a great diet. So he lived almost naked in a barrel in the middle of the marketplace, and he showed that he was completely untroubled by this existence. That he didn't need to rely on any external things for his happiness. Aristotle likewise says, we acquire the virtues by practicing them. So being a good human takes practice. It's like learning to drive or learning to play the saxophone. You learn how to do it by practicing it over and over until it becomes what he called second nature. So you take philosophy and you turn it into habits that just happen automatically, so that in any situation you'll automatically do the right thing. Musonius Rufus, who was a Roman Stoic, said, "How could we acquire courage if we had merely learned that the things which seem dreadful are not to be feared, but had no experience in showing courage? Upon the learning of the lessons appropriate to each and every excellence, practical training must follow." So it's no good just reading a book and thinking, oh, that's interesting. You've got to go and test it out. See how you cope in real life situations. See if you don't just read about courage. Go to a battlefield. See how you cope with that. Epictetus says, scornfully and full of contempt, "As the case stands now, we are spirited and fluent in the lecture room, but drag us into practice, and you will find us miserably shipwrecked." So, a philosopher can be great in the lecture room, but how does he actually cope in life? So the idea here is that philosophy is a way of life. It's something we practice in all different situations. It's something we practice, on the battlefield. It's something we practice in love. It's something you practice in the office, and particularly on your deathbed. Socrates said that philosophy was training to die. So, the moment of your death is the ultimate test of your philosophical practice. How do you die? How well do you die? How do we get from there to here? How do we get from the ancients' conception of philosophy as there's something that informs every aspect of our life and really kind of, heals us of emotional suffering, to the modern conception of philosophy, which is something rather refined, very specialized, and quite hard to understand for ordinary people. Ancient philosophy was very much for ordinary people. It was for men and women, even slaves. So Epictetus was actually a slave, but he learned philosophy, nonetheless, and became the great Stoic philosopher, even though he was born a slave. How do we go from that to it becoming such a specialized thing that most of us don't understand? Well, one theory is that it was all the fault of universities. So universities were set up in the Middle Ages. And at that point, philosophy stopped being a kind of ascesis that people practiced in the street or out in real life, and it became institutionalized. So, it happened within an institution. You had to win funding from the institution. You had to obey the rules of the institution. You had to study and then pass an exam. So it shifted from something that you worked on to try and transform yourself to something you studied in order to pass an exam and hopefully get a career, to get a profession. And there were always, all through the history of philosophy over the last kind of 600 years or so, there have been philosophers who've been a bit outside that system and who've criticized it. So Thoreau, for example, he was a bit like a modern Diogenes. He went and lived in the wild, supposedly, in his hut in Walden. Actually, he was living in his friend's garden, but he claimed he was living in the wild. And he said, very scornfully, there are nowadays professors of philosophy, but not philosophers, so it's become just something we study and make a career from. Schopenhauer said, university philosophy is mere fencing in front of a mirror. Its goal is to give students opinions which are to the liking of the minister who hands out the chairs. And then you have the kind of revolutionary philosopher, these outsiders like Rousseau and Marx, who say, the point isn't just to interpret the world, the point is to change it. So that's one theory of where philosophy went wrong. It became institutionalized, it became shut up in this ivory tower of academia, and it stopped speaking to ordinary people like us. It became more and more a kind of internal, specialized, jargonized conversation. So what that still left us, ordinary people, us, with emotional problems, looking for help and solace. And what happened, I would argue, in the 20th century, is that self-help moved into that vacuum, particularly like in America in the 20th century. So you suddenly had this self-help industry growing up from like 1920 onwards, and it became absolutely huge. It became a kind of huge industry. If you go into bookstores now, the self-help section is probably a lot bigger than the philosophy section. And what we see, if you look at the kind of the self-help books that are the best sellers of the last 100 years, is a lot of them draw on the ideas of ancient philosophy. So I've talked about this idea of the cognitive theory of the emotions, the idea that, in the words of Marcus Aurelius, life itself is but what you deem it. It's this famous quote of Aurelius's. So the idea of that is, your thoughts kind of create your reality, so become more aware of what you're thinking and what you're believing. That idea has been recycled over and over by self-help. So, for example, Dale Carnegie, who wrote, what's it called, How to Make Friends and Influence People, he called that quote by Marcus Aurelius 8 words that can transform your life. And if you look at, just some selection of self-help, James Allen, who wrote As a Man Thinketh, probably one of the best-selling self-help books, he wrote, "A man is literally what he thinks." Dr. Phil says, "There is no reality, only perception." Paul McKenna, the hypnotist, says, "Your experience of life is primarily affected by the perspective you view it from." Eckhart Tolle says, "The primary cause of unhappiness is never the situation, but your thoughts about it." So really, an awful lot of self-help comes down to that very simple idea that the Stoics came up with 2,000 years ago. But if you want to write a self-help book, the thing is to come out with this idea and pretend that you just invented it, and put the word "new" in front of it, and then you'll make a healthy career. Problem is, I would say, with self-help, is that they've taken this idea that our thoughts kind of create our reality, and they've taken it too far. They've turned it into almost this magical idea that our thoughts literally create reality. And if you want to be rich, just think of money and you will be rich. What they call the law of attraction. If you want to be very rich, just write a book about that, and call it like The Secret or The Key, or 8 Steps to Wealth or something. So they've claimed more than the ancient philosophers claimed. They've turned it into this magical idea that all you have to do is think something and it will happen, which is not what the Stoics were saying. They were saying that your emotions are affected by your beliefs. So you can definitely change your emotions, but that doesn't mean you can suddenly magically change the outside world. But ancient philosophy has had an impact on psychology as well, on modern psychology. So in the 1950s, a psychologist called Albert Ellis read Stoic philosophy, and he came across that quote of Epictetus's, that it's not events but our opinions about it that causes suffering. He was training in psychoanalysis at the time, but it wasn't really working. He was seeing his clients every day for years, and they weren't getting better. And he read this quote, and it was like a light bulb went off in his head. And he suddenly thought, this is the answer to psychology, that we need to focus not on childhood trauma, not on subconscious, Oedipus problems or something like that, but we need to focus on our clients' beliefs. We need to find out how they're interpreting the world, and then we need to get them to change that interpretation